And I'll call this meeting to order. Welcome to the Salt Lake City Planning Commission for June 8th, 2022. I think we are just missing one person. Did Levi say he was coming?
He did. I don't know why he's not here.
Okay. Well, we have enough for a quorum. So let's go ahead and jump into our agenda. The first step we have is the approval of the minutes, and they were edited. So I hope you've had a chance to look at those, and if I could get a motion.
I'll move we approve the minutes from the last meeting.
Okay.
Are the meetings from last week I don't think they're in there.
They're for the previous one. Sorry.
Oh,
We're a meeting behind on our minutes. So this, oh heck.
I'll move that we approve the minutes from the meeting, the prior meeting.
If you give me a second with this. Yeah, there we go. They are from May 11th.
From May 11th.
Okay. So I have a motion to approve the minutes from May 11th.
Second?
I have a motion from Maureen and a second from Andra. Any discussion on those? Okay, let's go ahead and take a vote. Rick? Yes. Maureen?
Yes.
Brenda?
Yes.
Adrian?
Yes.
John?
Abstain.
And you just have to state why you're abstaining.
Sorry.
That's all. Cool. Amy?
Yes.
Andra?
Yes.
And Mike?
Yes.
Okay, that motion passes. Moving on to report of the chair. I don't think I have anything. Maureen?
I don't have anything.
Okay, we have a report of the director. Nick?
I'm going to try to speak directly into the microphone so I don't get scalded this time. Scolded. Just real quick, last night the city council made a decision on an item that came before the Planning Commission several months ago, the proposed rezoning of the Western Garden site on 600 East by Trolley Square. They did approve that last night with subject to a development agreement that applied a rear yard setback next to some of the homes on the small inner court street, and also with some parking requirements. That project, whatever happens in the future there, is still going to be required to go through the Historic Landmarks Commission for new construction approval. I also want to let you know that as you have seen at several of the recent meetings, we have additional new employees, so you'll start seeing more new faces. And if it hasn't occurred to people, the one thing that you're going to see is that we have a lot of, I don't know the right way to say this, but because younger is the wrong word, but we have a lot of planners who have less experience than what maybe we've been used to. And so we're going through a number of Salt Lake City specific training opportunities with those employees, whether we're talking about subdivisions, conditional uses, our processes, and things like that. So we want to make sure that the Planning Commission knows that we're doing everything we can to ensure that those employees are successful and that they're providing not just the Planning Commission, but the community with the resources that everybody deserves. So along those lines, yesterday we had a division-wide presentation training. So you'll probably start seeing us make slightly different types of presentations to the commission, different roles for staff versus applicants, hopefully to kind of streamline that process a little bit. And we'll start having discussions with the commission about maybe some other ways that we can help shorten that amount of time that we're taking in presentations and Q&As and things like that. We don't want to lose the important things, but we also want to give the commission and the audience the right information that they need to know, and then with the details have questions asked of us instead of trying to assume what all the information that needs to be presented. So you'll see some of that as well. And I think with that, that was all I had.
Okay, I will just interject there that when I first started getting involved, I don't even remember how many years ago, 12, 13, 14, 15, the notice I would get, that postcard, because I wasn't involved in the community council, that postcard was the first time I would ever get a notice of what something was happening. So coming to the planning commission was my very first opportunity to get that information. So once you got involved with the community council, then obviously you dialed in way ahead of time. But so that's a really difficult challenge for you.
Yeah.
Because this assumption that, you know, you're going to have people in the audience who that is their first time really getting this information, and we can't leave them out.
Yeah, so just so you know, one of the things that has been a relatively recent change that we're doing, even though our code doesn't require it. So as many of you know, our code requires a 45-day early engagement period, but the only required notice for that is to the community councils. Mm-hmm. We've actually, for 4 or 5 years now, been sending those out to all of the abutting owners and residents as well.
Yeah.
Because that's really where it's important to make people aware, because that's where they can weigh in and let us know what the issues are. And so that's a big change. We actually have a pending code change regarding public engagement that includes that as a requirement, and some other things to help, I guess, set more clear expectations for why we do engagement and what that is. It's been pending in front of the city council that this body reviewed, I think, in 2017. So it's been there for a while. So just to let you know, we are going above and beyond what our code requires for that. And in many cases, because we can't charge an applicant for that, we've been absorbing that through our budget, which we're draining our noticing budget quite a bit. But we're still going to do it, and we'll find ways to deal with the other stuff later.
I think that in all of my years being involved, I've never thought that you all didn't try to really go above and beyond to include people. That may not be the things you hear from people, but I know you do, and I know you want to hear from people. So it's just a matter of when those notices were going out and the opportunities to get involved. So I just think so as it relates to then streamlining the presentations, that's where it gets difficult to parse out who's in the audience and who's here. And like we're all coming at it from different levels of information we have so that we don't leave those guys out. All right, well then let's move on to the Planning Commission discussion, which is our new item on our agendas. This is our opportunity for commissioners to bring up questions or ideas or whatnot for the director, and we can start these conversations. We have it settled for 10 minutes, so we'll see how that goes since this is our first one. But go ahead, Andrew.
I'm confused a little bit about the permitted uses in Sugar House Business District 1, particularly as they align with the stated purpose of the zoning code. When I look at the zoning map online, it discusses that like walkability as a key sort of criteria for that zoning code, and yet restaurant drive-throughs seem to be a permitted use in that zoning code. I'm just wondering how we reconcile that.
And just to remind you that some items may not get a full answer at this meeting. They may just take it back and then need to do some research. So
the way to do that obviously is to change the code so that those uses are either not allowed if they don't match the purpose statement, or that they go through some other conditional process to ensure that they are designed and arranged and operated in a way that they still do meet that purpose statement. And so if there's 3 different ways that a code amendment can be initiated. For your purpose, the Planning Commission is one of those bodies that does have the authority to initiate zoning changes. So in our code, the city bodies that can do that are the mayor, the city council, and the planning commission. Nobody else can. So I can't initiate that. Another department head can't initiate that. It's only those three entities. And so that the process for doing that is we would want to make sure that there's a discussion with the commission as to whether or not there's support to start the process. That doesn't mean that's a discussion. That's not a discussion about whether you support removing or changing that use. It's do we want to have that discussion, go through a public process so that we can get that information to make a recommendation to the city council. That has to be placed on an agenda because it is an official action by the planning commission, and those have to be advertised. There generally would not be a public hearing to initiate it. That would come later. With that, we can, if that's something that the planning commission wants to consider doing, then we can put together some information on what that might look like and kind of some cursory what it'll take type of document for the commission at a future hearing or a future meeting, if that's what the commission wants.
Okay. Anybody else? I know we have questions. I know everybody does, so go ahead.
In the past 2 or 3 years, we've passed some very important recommendations on to City Council that have to do with parking, that have to do with not affordable housing, but single-room occupancy housing, and other important things which it would seem to me should be a priority, and they have gone nowhere. So can you tell us why that process seems to be stuck?
I wish I could. From the administration standpoint, we have given several briefings to the city council about how all of those proposals work together, how they align with the city's current growing SLC, which is our housing plan. And from what we understand, the last one was, I think, in April, beginning of April. We've done it now twice over the past 18 months. With the parking proposals specifically, the last time the planning commission talked, or the city council talked about that, was last fall. And they asked us to do some research on a couple of changes that they wanted. Because of the workload, trying to fit that research into our time and our everything else is sometimes challenging. So we did the research. We met with them in small groups to kind of go over what we were finding. And then we sent them a follow-up transmittal about what their requested research says and what the recommendations are. One of the big sticky points is that they wanted to eliminate. Right now in that proposal, there's a statement in there that in non-residential zoning districts and for non-residential uses, if a lot is under 5,000 square feet, there's no minimum parking requirement. The purpose of that is to promote the small-scale development and provide places, particularly for small businesses, where they're not going to get tripped up with unnecessary changes to property, so make those existing uses be able, and existing properties, to change over easily. The council asked us what the impacts would be if they raised that to 10,000 square feet. And we try to do all kinds of research on it, and there's so many variables that we couldn't tell them what to expect. You just couldn't do it. And so that is what we spent most of the time. We spent probably 2 months researching other city codes and trying to find examples and trying to create some fitting examples in parcels in the city and find other existing developments so we could analyze those and figure out what the impacts are. And we just couldn't find anything that gave us any indication. So that has been sent back to the council. From what we've been told, that they will start scheduling those for follow-up in the next coming months. Right now, they're obviously focused on the budget. May and June are almost always city council budget time. And then July, they only meet once or twice. And so I would expect to start seeing some of those things happen late summer into fall. So the big ones, the parking chapter, the shared housing, the RMF 30 proposal. Am I missing one?
I think there's a
Oh.
Sugar House Business District.
Those were
design guide.
adopted.
They were?
Yeah. The other one was associated with the fleet block. And if you remember, we proposed a new zone that for the fleet block that could replace some of the CG zoning in that area. And so those seem to be, at least there's some acknowledgement that the council wants to move forward with those. What they've told us is that they want to have all of those done before the end of next budget year. Keep in mind, that's June 2023. So hopefully those all start, and that's sooner rather than later.
Amy, you have a question?
My first experience with planning commission or planning department
Closer into your microphone.
was as a community council. So, and I didn't know, maybe they're all smarter than me, but I didn't know that the staff report existed. I just came and made my statements without ever reading a staff report. So this is kind of a question about public comments. Like when somebody emails the planner and says, this is what I think about this, and there's kind of information in it that's not right or something like that, like, could your planner respond and say, you can read the staff report here, or you know what I mean? Like to kind of like set them straight so they don't come to a meeting mad about something that they could have found out about. That's kind of like a suggestion or a question. And then my other question is, there have been a few times where after we have a meeting here, now that we're on the planning commission, we get a forwarded message that says, please tell the planning commission I think this about the meeting. And then whoever writes back to that person, does anybody ever respond to that person and say, here's a recording of the meeting and you can find out the answer here? And could we see a carbon copy of that or something? My question.
Yeah, so the first part of that, the response really depends on when we get the comments. And so ideally, public comments come in before we finalize a staff report, because then, one, they're included in the staff report, and two, they are responded to, right, in writing, in the official record. Sometimes when we get public input, it comes hours before the meeting starts. We don't necessarily have time to relay back any sort of misinformation. But our staff does respond to people when they say, oh, I think this zoning amendment should be denied when it's a conditional use or something. And we'll correct them about those kinds of things. We're like, this really actually isn't a zoning amendment, it's a conditional use. But legally it has to be approved if it meets the standards. The planning commission's role is to make sure that the standards are complied with. And so we do that. As far as comments received after the planning commission has made either a recommendation or a decision, if it's a recommendation for something that goes to the city council, those get forwarded to the city council. Even though they may be addressed to the planning commission, they're still part of the public record because there's still that opportunity for public input through the council process. So they get tacked on to the end of the transmittal that we send. If it's something where you've already made a decision, I suppose we can probably find a way to let the commission know that we've received, that we have responded. But one of we probably want to do that as a separate type of email, just to make sure that we're keeping like the record clean and something's not confused as being part of the record after you make a decision. But we certainly can update you on when we get those types of comments. Say, yeah, we've responded, we've let them know that the decision's been made, and that if they want, that here's the appeal process.
Okay, we're a little over 10 minutes, so we're getting an idea of how many questions we can fit in that time. But we'll be doing this every meeting, so I hope that we can continue to take advantage of this and learn together and move forward. So, thank you, Nick. I think that lets you know that we definitely needed something like this because we have a bunch of questions. All right, moving on to the public hearings portion of our agenda is the Kozo House Design Review Modifications at approximately 633 West, 200 North. This is case number PLN PCM 2020-00258, and Amy Thompson is the planner tonight. Oh, one caveat for the record, I just needed to note that Levi is in attendance now. Okay, sorry, Amy, go ahead.
Okay, good evening, Commission. Again, this is a request for modifications to a design review approval for a development known as the Kozo House at approximately 165 North, 6 West. The development site is outlined in orange on the map. For commissioners that have been here for a few years, you may remember this project was previously handled by Caitlin in our office. She has moved on to Park City, so I'm taking it forward for her. The project was reviewed at an October 14th Planning Commission meeting, and it was tabled to allow time for the applicant to incorporate changes that were suggested by the Commission, and it was later approved on December 2nd, 2020, with an extension granted on November 10th, 2021. The design review was granted for building length greater than 200 feet, blank wall areas greater than 15 feet, and entrance spacing requirements. Since that time, the developer of the project has changed hands. It's now being developed by DB Urban Communities, who's represented this evening by Bryce Baker and Mike Holopeter. Hopefully I've pronounced that right. The new design team has made some changes to the design, which has resulted in alterations to the exterior of the building and the modifications that are before you this evening. The goal of this presentation is to present the information submitted by the applicant so you can make a decision. If the Commission denies the modifications, the applicant will be required to comply with the original approval. Staff is recommending approval of the proposed modifications. Modifications to the approved design generally relate to the unit and retail space reduction, increase in parking garage access, and the design of the elevations. The revised design of the building includes a variety of floor plans ranging in size from studio units to 2-bedroom units, which has reduced the overall count to 242. Originally, the approval just included micro units, 319 micro units. So the reduction in units is because of the change in the mix of the unit type. Additionally, the commercial space has been reduced. The applicants maintained approximately 2,730 square feet of retail and approximately 2,100 square feet of office and leasing space. In terms of parking increase, the Commission approved 141 parking stalls as part of the original design, and the revised number is 190 spaces. The revised number complies with the minimums and maximums for the zoning district in the ordinance. The vehicular access has also changed. Originally, there were 2 vehicle access points, one off of 200 North and one off of 600 West. Concerns regarding the traffic on 200 North, a residential street, were raised during the processing of the petition. So that 200 North entrance has been removed, and the remaining entrance on 600 West is the only entrance that is now proposed as part of the project. And then the design of the elevations has changed, and I will go over those on the following slides. The shape of the building and size has generally not changed. There's some slight modifications to the location of materials to help with the overall composition and layout of the units. And some of the locations of windows and patios have shifted. There's been additions to them, or some of them, in some cases, have been deleted. These upcoming slides, again, compare the approved design elevation to the modified design, and the applicant has provided a detailed list of their modifications right up front in attachment A of the staff report on the first page of that attachment. So this is the north elevation. Again, that's the 200 North elevation. The revised design maintains the building break inset at the location of the break that was approved by the commission, which helps break up that 200-foot facade. It also maintains the sunken-in living room area, which is located to the far left of the elevation on the screen, and it's on the corner of 2nd North and 6th West. The ground floor glass has shifted slightly and also been reduced in some areas, but again, it does still meet the ground floor glass requirements. As mentioned earlier, the 200 South parking entrance, which is located to, I don't know if you can see the cursor on here, yeah, so this area here, that was the previous parking entrance that has since been removed. On the east elevation, the only parking garage access again is on this elevation. That's the elevation facing 600 West. It's been shifted to the southern corner of that facade to maximize the distance from the intersection of 200 North and 600 West, which again was a concern at the time from the commission and the community. There was a condition of approval on the previous approval that the applicant engage in a traffic study, and they are currently doing that despite removing that other parking entrance on 200 North. On the east elevation, or excuse me, this is the south elevation. This elevation has not changed much. Screened openings have been added to the ground floor to allow for ventilation into the parking garage. The size of some of the openings in the upper stories has also been revised. And same with the west elevation, again, screened openings to the parking garage have been added when previously it was just solid cement. And a mural space has been added to the northwest corner, which is shown on the far left of the elevation on the screen. The last thing that I want to talk about is not necessarily a modification per se from the previous approval, but the design standards in the TSA zone require active ground floor use along 200 North and 600 West, and indicate that it needs to be for 80% with a depth of 25 feet. And they're providing the 80%, however, the depth is along 200 North is only 21 feet wide. Deep. Again, this is not a deviation from the previous approval, but it wasn't called out as a modification. So I just wanted the commission to be aware that the depth of those spaces along 200 North is 21 feet approximately instead of the 25. The spaces along 600 West are deeper than required. They're approximately 29 feet deep. Staff has reviewed the proposed modifications for compliance with the standards for design review and finds that the revised design is substantially similar to the original approval. Again, we're recommending approval on the proposed modifications. In terms of public process for the modifications, notice of public hearing was mailed out, sign posted on site. I understand the previous approval had a number of public comments. We have not received any public comments as of today on the proposed modifications. And again, staff is recommending approval on the proposed modifications. And I'm happy to answer any questions at this time, and the applicant is also available as
All
well.
right, thank you, Amy. Commissioners, any questions for staff? Okay, we'll go ahead and call up the applicant, Bryce Baker, and then was it Matt? Mike, if you wanted to come up as well, state your names for the record. Your name wasn't written down, Mike, so I didn't have it in front of me.
He has the harder name to remember.
Well, that- and then you'll have up to 10 minutes, but you don't need to take all that time. Did you have a presentation you needed Amy to help you load, or you?
We can handle most with
Okay.
Amy. Amy's already responded. My name is Bryce Baker. I'm principal and founder of DB Urban Communities.
Mike Hollopeter. I'm with Alpha Development as well.
Okay, you might have to speak up into your microphone because I couldn't hear you.
So I appreciate the opportunity to present. And really, all we're here is to thank a lot in the process. We got involved in this project a little over a year ago after the previous approvals. And so there had been a lot of there were conditions of approval, and there was a lot of comment about the project. And so as we met with the owner, which the underlying owner has not changed, just the developer has. So we've replaced the previous developer. But we started a process and knew that as we looked at the community, as we looked at the building, as we looked at the input that we were receiving, that there were some changes that were beneficial. Part addressed the comments that weren't part of the approved plan. So during the last public hearing, when the PD was presented, there were comments that were never fully addressed in the plan, but it was approved, like the access off of 200 North. 200 North is a dead-end road that from 600 West to the west goes into I-15, so it dead ends. And half of the parking for the project was being loaded onto that street to then hit a roundabout. We internalized that parking and used ramping inside the building to have the one access point. So it has more parking under that design, but has a single access point to 600 West. So we avoid the roundabout and any further traffic heading from the north. We are engaging a traffic study based on this plan. Whether it's approved or not, we're paying for that. So it's underway right now. I don't have that copy. As we looked at the submittal process and going through, we've got a lot of people to thank. One is Ava Lopez from the mayor's office. She helped in community outreach and engagement. We had a meeting starting in October. So David at Mestizos, appreciate him for hosting a meeting so we could meet with the community and start getting some real actionable items or input. We've met with members of the Rose Park Brown Berets. We've met with Maria Garcia's from NeighborWorks as an actionable item that came out of that community meeting. They were looking at whether we could sell this property for sale to Maria, and so we had a conversation with her. So we've been following up on a lot of the input that we received from the neighborhood to try to get to and arrive where we are today. So while there's not much on a minor modification of the exterior, we kept the same percentages of materials, we met the code. It feels like there hasn't been a whole lot done in a year, but there's been a tremendous amount of work that's been done to present this plan, which we think better represents what should be here, as opposed to 319 micro units, which is approved. So we're here to address any questions or comments you may have, but certainly have enjoyed engaging in the process early to make sure that we get to this point.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. I was one who was very vocal about that dead end thing on 200 North, so I appreciate that you took a look at that. As with most things, I was outvoted, so that's why it wasn't followed up on, but that's fine. But I appreciate you looking at that. All right, commissioners, any questions for the applicant at this time?
Yeah, the patio on the corner, that's a sunken living room. Previously, it was opening up into a retail space, and I don't think I see that now.
So the retail space to the south of the sunken living room hasn't been changed. So that continues to be there along 600 West. So the eastern facade of the building that runs along 600 West continues to have the retail. The sunken living room is in the corner, and so there's ramping and accessibility through doors to that sunken living room. And then around the corner, we talked about the total, but there's 21, and I'm going to pull this up just because I did a good job, 2,730 square feet on the east side of the building along 600 West. That's the retail that you're referring to that goes to the sunken living room.
Yes.
As it wraps around the corner on 200 North, there's roughly 2,100 square feet of additional space. Part of that will be taken up by our leasing center, but part of it is
By a what center?
the leasing.
Okay.
So our management office. And part of it will be community space based on feedback from residents that we heard.
Okay. And the opening on 200 South,
200 North, you mean?
sorry.
Commissioner, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Not to correct you, but just want to make
No,
sure it's
no,
on
you're
on the record,
you're
right?
right. You can correct me when I'm wrong. It's okay. I think that there was previously, I'm not sure that previously there was a parking garage right behind it. There was something behind it, but you were able to see up into that courtyard.
Traffic that you're referring to.
It may be possible to do that now, but I don't.
So
Can't really
it
tell.
continues, Commissioner. So this is the floor plan, or this is the site plan at that level where we come up from the street level.
Right, this is the, like,
Onto
first
the
floor
amen-
plan, yeah, okay.
So this is the amenity floor. So it's actually the level 3 of the building. We have a subterranean, a level 1, and a level 2. And so that keyhole that existed previously is the same height and the same location,
Okay.
and functions the same way from the ability to get from the street directly up onto the 3rd level amenity deck.
Okay, that answers the question.
Elevations are hard to see. The 3D renderings are a little bit better, but
Okay.
kind of.
And the final question I have is, the top floor in the original building was quite distinguished from the design that you're showing now. Not in terms of plan, but certainly in terms of elevation and articulation. Now it seems like it just kind of ends. So can you speak to that a little bit?
So the same uses exist up on the 6th floor of the building as before. So there's an outdoor amenity deck with a hole through the roof for live planting. That's the amenity deck space for the building. So that includes business center, business lounge, a flex office. We don't use co-working anymore. We use flex office space. And then some residential units. So I think what, Commissioner, you may be looking at is the opening, the tree, if I can call it out on this plan. This tree has moved from the north side to the south side of the building in the plans, but the use and the function is still there.
Yeah, but it's definitely a different kind of expression, so that you have a very distinguished top on this building, on the previous building, whereas when you have now is kind of, maybe there's a tiny bit of top on the one end, but otherwise it's very much like the facade, for example, the window articulation is exactly the same on the top floor as it is on the lower floors, which is not the case in the previous version. I'm just asking for clarification.
I'm not sure that I can clarify that one. I'm sorry.
Look at the top floor of the bottom right, okay? Picture.
Top floor, the bottom right picture.
Right, and it has...
Glass, where it has the
It has
glass
glass,
for a unit.
it's taller, it's got glass along the whole facade, and then, I know it's maybe not even the same facade. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. But that's the 600
same-
West facade, right?
The bottom right is
Yes.
the 600, the top left would be the 200
Right.
north.
So,
view.
do we have that, where's that elevation? Do we have that elevation? Sorry. We do, I know. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm asking here. Oh, yeah, I see what you're doing, okay.
Switch files, sorry. for the
Okay,
comparison.
I got it. I understand what you're doing. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions for the applicant? Okay, with that, if you guys will just hold tight, we'll open the public comment period, and if anything comes up during that, I will give you the opportunity to respond to after I close that.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will open up the public comment period for the Kozo house design review modifications. Is there anyone here from the community council? Okay. Is there anybody here that wishes to speak to this item? Okay, I don't see any hands raised. Kelsey, did we have any emails? Nope. Okay, seeing none, I will close the public comment period and bring it back to the commission for a discussion. If you have any comments at this time, then we can direct those to staff or the applicant, or discuss amongst ourselves. I will say, Brenda, I totally understood what you were saying.
Oh, thank you. Wow.
I agree, it looks very, very different.
Yeah. Well, I just think that, there's a kind of top that has, a kind of heavier roof and then an indentation of the whole facade versus just the southern half, which I think is a better look. for the
I actually agree
building.
with that.
Yeah.
I personally do, yeah.
So I don't like that part.
Like that part as well.
I don't know if that's enough to deny this petition, but, or to table it for, they can make changes. It depends on how other
Yeah.
people feel, of course.
I would think at this point,
Actually, there's really, especially a lot of, there's a lot of, this is a new, practically an entirely new project. I mean, it's got a completely different parking ratio, a completely different unit mix, a completely different design. I mean, it's really not a revision, it's a whole, I don't know why you wouldn't just call this a whole new project.
well, I felt that way about the second iteration. I thought that was a completely different design and configuration, but, so where that threshold lands, I don't know. I guess a comment to the applicant then is modifying that top to kind of emulate the articulation and the design of the previous iteration, something you would be open to doing? Because I also agree with Brenda that it had a much more distinct look and was more attractive.
This is the elevation you're referring to.
So I think as a gesture of being friendly, is that something that you would be open to
Yes.
changing and going back to how that looked?
I guess
Or-
the question is it a matter of the materiality that's being carried to the south of it, continuing over that corner?
It's not material. There's a balcony, if you wish, that extends along the whole top of the building.
So would you like us to flip the balcony?
No,
Because
see,
that's
the
what-
whole
that's
top of the
essentially what-
building is a balcony.
That's essentially what we've done, is we've flipped.
There isn't a balcony on the north side of the top of the building.
Excuse me, Bryce,
Correct,
will you
yes.
please speak into the
Sorry,
microphone?
I will speak directly into it.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
So the balcony, correct, the glass, the void that's being created by the unit that's in that corner is
Yes.
using the glass as the void instead of the balcony. There is no balcony to that unit. It's the top of that part of the building. But that deck that is there continues and wraps the east side to the south of the building and then around the south side of the building. So the location of the balcony has changed as part of
Right,
this.
I see what you're saying.
It might be the colors as well that make it look like it's not really articulated in this design.
Yeah, I think this elevation doesn't do it justice, the 2D version versus the 3D, because I would agree that the 2D elevations look really flat and make it really difficult to kind of judge, but once you look at it in 3D, I think it's a different project. I'm typically against kind of the big hat on top of buildings where they have these terminuses that are just kind of old-fashioned in the way that we design. So I usually push back on that kind of stuff. I think there's other ways we can terminate the top of a building other than a giant overhang. And I do see that there are balconies still on the facade, so I don't know. I think it's kind of an aesthetic judgment call at this point.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, if the commission is, it's not a huge deal one way or the other. I mean, it wouldn't all be that difficult to fix either, I must say, because you could move one of the amenity spaces to the north and put the apartment that's in the corner there to the south. So,
Andrew?
either way.
Yeah, I guess I don't have a good eye for aesthetics in general, and maybe especially not with buildings, but I do feel that from reading through the staff report, it met the standards. And so from a kind of, if aesthetics are not part of the standards, I don't think we should be voting based on aesthetics. As much as, it may be aesthetically unpleasing in practice, it's hard for me to see the rendering, but I'm not sure that should be something we're voting on, if it really is just aesthetics.
Oh, I
Anyone?
wish you wouldn't use terms like just aesthetics.
Yeah.
Because that's really, no, I'm serious. I mean, I don't want to give the planning commission, of course, a lecture, but I think it's very important to understand that we do a lot of work around design. Design is part of what we do, part of what we think about when we look at these projects entirely. You know, we're talking about materials and window openings and the length of the building and the opening onto the sidewalk, and those are all design aesthetic issues, if you wish. So I think I'm not going to go to the mat on this one,
Yeah.
for sure, but I think it's certainly something that we have to consider and have a right to consider too.
Okay. Any other discussion items or comments? Otherwise, I'm open to a motion.
I'm willing to make a motion.
Go ahead, Adrian.
First of all, thank you for your community engagement. That's very much appreciated, and I think the fact that we don't have a bunch of people here protesting your project speaks well for the success of your outreach effort, so thank you for that. Based on the analysis and findings listed in the staff report, the information presented, and the input received during the public hearing, I move that the Planning Commission approve the modifications to the Design Review Approval Petition PLN PCM 2020-00258.
I'll second that.
Okay, I have a motion from Adrian and a second from Mike. Any discussion to the motion? Okay, let's go ahead and take a vote. John?
Yes.
Amy?
Yes.
Maureen?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Levi?
Yes.
Brenda?
Yes.
Andra?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
And Adrian?
Yes.
Okay, that motion passes unanimously. Thank you both for your time tonight. Good luck.
Thank you. And I appreciate the passion on aesthetics. We do our best.
Well, I look forward to seeing it actually finally built. So.
Thank you.
All right, that concludes the public hearing portion of our agenda this evening. We're going to be moving into a work session. Work sessions are entirely just commission driven, so there's no public comment portion to them. We have our first two items, and we're not action items, so we're not voting on anything, but we're going to be giving feedback and direction on both of these items. So the first up is Ballpark Station Area Plan. This is case number PLN PCM 2022-00323, and I do not have your name in front of me. It's not on here.
Oh, I apologize for that. Nan Larson.
That's right. You know, it's like there's too many of you, and I
Lot of
don't
us.
see you every time,
Get it? Yes.
but you've been around for a long time, and my apologies.
Chair.
Floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. And to your defense, I haven't presented in person to you all for about 2 years, so I completely understand it. So the purpose of this presentation is to give the Planning Commission a briefing on the Ballpark Station Area Plan and to get initial feedback and specific comments on any potential issues with the Station Area Plan. So the Ballpark Station Area Plan was initiated by the mayor in December 2020. The consultant was GSBS, and whose staff worked with closely to identify goals for the future development of the community. The Station Area Plan is intended to capitalize on community assets and guide future development in the community. The small area plan, and I'll use Station Area Plan and small area plan interchangeably in this presentation. The boundaries are within both the Central Community Master Plan and the Downtown Master Plan. The boundary includes the neighborhoods from I-15 to the west side of State Street and 900 South to 1700 South. During the development of the draft plan, the Downtown Master Plan, the the Central Community Master Plan, Growing SLC, Plan Salt Lake, and the Salt Lake City Street Lighting Master Plan were considered. Other plans that were also considered that haven't yet been adopted were Life on State, a student ballpark master plan project, the Homeless Resource Center's neighborhood action strategies, and the Salt Lake City Park and Public Lands Needs Assessment. When the process began in December of 2020, the consultant and city staff spent about 9 months identifying goals and meeting with the community members and stakeholders. An online survey was published, and notices of this survey were sent to the entire community. A steering committee met throughout 2021 to discuss and make recommendations on the draft plan, and staff attended multiple community council meetings to answer questions and take comments. The Ballpark Station Area Plan proposes key concepts to guide development and redevelopment in the neighborhood. Those key concepts will have significant impact on the Ballpark neighborhood. The first key concept that we'll be reviewing today are the proposed 6 big moves that will help the community transform the neighborhood as pressure for development occurs. These include create and apply a Ballpark station area, a Ballpark station area transit station area in the area identified as the heart of the neighborhood. Reconfigure the Ballpark track station to improve access to the west. Improve 1300 South for pedestrians by creating new crossings and expanding and upgrading the pedestrian realm. Create a sense of place at and around the stadium. Repurpose parking lots and underutilized properties to add activity to the heart of the neighborhood, and invest in community amenities and green space to balance density with livability factors. The goals, strategies, and actions are also listed in the small area plan on pages 11 through 15. The goals here are broad in nature and direct future development in a larger picture. Strategies are more focused than a goal and describe ways to implement the goals. And action items describe specific ways to implement the goal as development occurs. The proposed strategies include connectivity, a safer pedestrian and bike network, address parking needs in the community, alleyway safety, enhance neighborhood green space, improve housing and opportunity, and mitigate displacement, and prioritize safety and security. Also included in the draft plan is a future land use map and the accompanying future land use designation, which is found on pages 17 through 19 of the draft plan. Each future land use designation describes the appropriate development pattern of the neighborhood where density, building height, land use, emphasize transportation modes, and catalyst areas are attributes of the designation. The future land use map is the section of the draft plan that we received the most public comments from, and we had modified the future land use map as a response to those comments. And as you all know, the future land use map will directly affect zoning map updates and amendments as the small area plan is implemented. As far as transportation goes, it is addressed in the plan in many different areas of the plan, which includes pages 14 through 16 and page 20. The recommendations include widening sidewalk widths, prioritizing heavily used corridors within the Ballpark neighborhood. The plan also recommends bike routes on major streets, which include 300 West and Main Street, and east and west routes to the north and south of the Ballpark station, which would include Paxton Avenues, Kensington, and Andrew Avenues. It also recommends easier access to the transit station with a pedestrian connection at Lucy Avenue to the north. And then finally, the last major item is the creation of a festival street. This festival street is proposed on West Temple Street to the immediate south of 1300 South between the track station to the northwest and Smith's Ballpark Stadium to the east. The festival street would create a sense of place through the creation of a community gathering place for game day or non-game day events, and it would close down that section of West Temple Street. So as far as next steps, after this briefing, staff will make final recommendations based on the comments we received here to the Ballpark plan before it will return to the Planning Commission at a later date for a potential recommendation to City Council. The anticipated timeline is for the plan to return to Planning Commission this summer for a possible recommendation to Council. Then a transmittal is anticipated to be sent to the Council for their review and possible adoption later this summer through early fall. So this is the time for the Commission to discuss or to give staff any feedback that you may have for us for the draft plan. on specific issues or just general comments. And I've included 4 questions in the memo that was forwarded to the Planning Commission, since these were the items that received the most public comments. And this is also a good time, if you have any questions, to ask staff those questions on the draft plan.
Okay, thank you, Nan. First of all, I want to say thank you for a great report, and that is probably the best future land use map I've seen. A lot of times they just bring in what the existing zoning is and doesn't give us a good vision, so I was really pleased to see that. So commissioners, any thoughts on this? Go ahead, Andra.
First of all, yeah, great plan. I especially love the icon for the festival street. If those of you who have not looked at it, it's on page 27. It's a really great icon. I guess I live not that far from there, and I'd really like to be able to bike. I live on the east side, and 1300 South is already a bike corridor basically up to State Street. And so for me to get to a lot of the retail on the west side there, like there's a Lowe's, there's the front climbing gym, which gives a discount if you bike there. I still can't get there under this map because there's not bike lanes on 1300 South. So I see what you're saying is you could go over to Paxton, but it's a bit circuitous to get to, 300, to get to some of that retail relative to 1300 South, so.
So now one of my comments was on one of the action items, which was to specifically call out doing raised pedestrian crosswalks on busy streets. I used a different term, but I can't remember what you said. And I feel like that action item is a little misguided because raised pedestrian crosswalks are the solution sometimes. That would not be a good solution on Main Street. It might be a better solution on West Temple, given the width of it. And so I felt like that specific call out for that action item should probably be a little bit more vague to tie into the goal of increasing pedestrian safety and pedestrian connectivity through the best possible measure, which may be a raised crosswalk, but it probably wouldn't be on those busy streets. So I just wanted to maybe point out that we wanted to maybe open that up a little bit more so that we could be informed by other possible solutions that might be better for whatever street is being looked at during a redevelopment process of what might help achieve that goal of prioritizing pedestrian safety. That was one thing that I didn't think was the best approach to go on that one. And we can just, any other comments, or we can just go down some of these questions so that Nan gets some feedback from us.
No, I would agree with the pedestrian issues. Like, I drive that street every single day, and between Lowe's and the Ballpark, it's incredibly dangerous. People are just constantly running across the street. And I've noticed that the train crossing doesn't have an ADA access at all. And so for somebody to cross, you actually have to cross on the track to get across the street. So I think it's incredibly important to really study and solve that issue.
Oh, I think the crossing on 13th South near the tracks is non-existent to borderline abysmal. Mm-hmm. I drive around there too for doggy daycare, and it's just, there is nowhere direction for them to cross, and so people are just going willy-nilly. That needs to have some serious enhancement. But that was just, that would just be an example of like saying we want to raise crosswalk there. It may not actually be the best approach. It may be, I don't know. But I know that oftentimes those are not what's going to achieve the result that we want. But people don't know all the possibilities. But that's where transportation comes in and giving them that opportunity to weigh in on those best things. But it's not even to say that needs to be improved. It needs to actually be, like, exist. It doesn't exist now. It's bad there. And I think that needs multiple crosswalks. So by the Indian Walking Center to Lucky 13, that needs a crosswalk there too, right? As well as the tracks.
Cross the street all the time to get to Lucky 13.
So it's like, we almost need to have some staggered crosswalk areas for people, because they're not going to walk over to the intersection or down to the tracks to cross if they just need to get to Lucky 13, which is what's going on that side of the road. Yeah, that needs some help.
I guess it's a question of, do you repeat what's happening on 900, where we have the street trees and a spot where you can kind of stop in the middle as you're crossing to slow down traffic, and then you get across the street, because there's so many people trying to cross at different places.
Yeah.
Would it be beneficial to have kind of a safety spot in the middle where people can actually?
Yeah, and that's where I think transportation should be piping in a little bit more about what is for whatever road you're talking about, whether it's Main Street or 13 South or whatever, that transportation comes in and like, these are the best possible methods for us to achieve that safety. But I think those little islands in the middle are I remember when I was in Europe and I first came across those, and I thought that was the best thing I've ever seen, because it didn't exist here. So yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities, and that is called out in the plan, those little islands. But I think depending on the street, that will dictate what methods might be better or most appropriate to achieve the goals, which I think are, I don't even know how to say like they're totally necessary, because it is a mess right there for pedestrians. And if you were going to try to bicycle further down, like Andrew does, it's the same. It's just a mess. So the question that Nan posed is, West Temple the most appropriate street for a festival street? I think you see a lot of nodding heads. I thought about this, and if you're going to close a street for a festival, you're going to be pushing traffic out onto, say, Main Street, which is probably the better street. I wouldn't want to close Main and then push it to West Temple, because West Temple is a lot smaller. So it seems like that is an appropriate street. If the community wants to have a festival street, that would be the place to do it. And then you wanted some comments on the draft future land use map. Is it sufficient? I already gave you my thoughts. Anyone else? To guide, is that land use map sufficient to guide development and redevelopment? I think we saw some comments from people who own property a little outside of the core that wanted to be included in that redevelopment. So I think that's a question for the commission as well. Those dividing lines, do those feel appropriate? Because certainly people that own property outside of that would like to be included, but then there were people who like own property but live there and aren't looking to redevelop that. Most likely didn't want to be included in that. So I think this is a good opportunity for you all to weigh in if you felt like those particular zones were appropriate for this community.
Is there a reason why we only did half of State Street?
In the plan, why only the west portion of State Street was included. I wasn't part of those initial discussions. Maybe Nick would, if Nick was part of that discussion.
I don't know that I was part of that discussion, but I do think that part of it is that the east side of State Street is, for the most part along that corridor, fairly different than the west side in terms of the interface with smaller scale development. Mostly there are some mixed housing along those side streets, but I think that's the primary reason. The other thing too is that we have another project that we're going to be restarting that went all the way through the development of a draft plan and then just kind of stopped because of other city priorities. And that was called the Life on State Plan, that addresses land use along all of State Street from downtown to 2100 South. And I think that would be the appropriate plan to address some of those really challenging interfaces between different development scales.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I think the only consideration I would have, because I spent a lot of time over there, would be that there's a lot of residential on that side of the street, and it's really small scale residential, but there are a lot of businesses on that street as well. And I think trying to find something that incentivizes that to develop alongside the same as across the street might not be a bad idea, to at least pick the first lot on that side of the street or find a way to kind of include that, but just a suggestion.
Well, I'm wondering, Nan, on the future land use map, the portion from Paxton to the funky freeway exit. I don't know what we really call that other than the funky freeway exit. Why you wouldn't want to extend this core zoning into that area as well?
So the north side of Paxton Avenue.
Yes.
I think that there was a discussion that the heart of the neighborhood had to stop somewhere, but we did also receive a public comment from that as well. That comment's definitely noted. We'll be discussing that.
Because I feel like I don't know how much, it's hard to tell with the overlay of like what the aerial is looking like. But I just was wondering, like, to create that little special pocket, because it seems like on the aerial there's a little mix of some larger buildings, but it's hard to tell with this shading.
That area has like some distinct residential streets that are still pretty much intact, right?
The what streets?
Up north of Paxton to the freeway ramp.
Yeah, initially that section, that was one section that we modified on the future land use map. Initially it was like medium density residential, and we modified it to the Jefferson Park mixed use area for the same reasons that Commission Member Barry had mentioned, that there is like a mix of land uses and building scale in that area.
I would just request maybe just doing a second look at that area. I'm not dictating what you should or shouldn't do, but it feels odd to just have this carved out in this really small zone. And if that makes the most sense to create that there, just kind of an extra review of that.
That's helpful, thank you.
And then, one of your final questions was that this plan was informed by the Transportation Master Plan and includes a connectivity map. And is this proposed connectivity map sufficient to meet the multimodal needs? That would, I guess, be a question for us. Do we feel like, we already kind of commented a little bit on that. I think that's one of the most important components, actually, to this small area plan is that connectivity and the priorities that you set. I feel like you've captured most of it. What do other commissioners think?
I share a lot of the same concerns, especially biking through the 13th South corridor. And I'm still not sure exactly how people on bikes are expected to get through the area, especially since we are proposing Paxton as a bike route, but there's no way to safely cross State Street at Paxton. So I see that as an issue that needs to be resolved.
The more you zigzag bike routes, the less bikers actually do it.
Actually, I think the more you use less heavily traffic streets, the more bikers will use them.
No, totally, but the more you keep moving them around.
You go around, but I think.
No, absolutely. I always preferred those. That's why I loved the Greenway on the S line when that. I'll go out of my way for that thing,
Yeah, right.
but because I can safely cross 7th East and State Street on the Greenway, right? So Mike's point is that if we don't have ways for bicyclists to safely get to that area, and we're creating them zigzagging, especially on busy streets like State Street, it's not going to happen. But you provide a nice line for them where they can safely cross, and I'd take it. That's what I do on the S line for sure.
I think one of the concerns in creating a designated bike route along 1300 South, speaking with transportation, is the amount of traffic along 1300 South. That it was
Endogenous of not having other modes of transit available on 1300 South. If you made it difficult to drive, people would drive less.
I don't know about that. I think it's
I wouldn't want to ride a bike on 1300 South.
I wouldn't either.
I wouldn't ride a bike in a bike lane on 1300 South.
Yeah, I live, excuse me, near 1300 South, and that bike lane's scary. And I'm the father of 4 children. I wouldn't take my kids there for reasons beyond just the cars trying to run them over and everything else that happens there with those bike lanes. I wish every bike lane that the city put in place ended up being used as a bike lane. That may be the case in a lot of areas of the city, but near where I live, that hasn't been the case. So that's my only concern.
People park in it.
People park on it, they'll camp on it, they'll do anything under the sun on it.
Yeah. It's a conundrum. I mean, we have a lot of different modes of transportation, from on foot to vehicles, and trying to accommodate them all is tough. But that's the city we want to create, so good luck, Nan. All right, any last comments for Nan on this?
I also have one other comment. I'm curious to see, I know 1700 South is on the southern end of this, but are there any planned street improvements for 1700 South, especially given that there's a proposed infill track station for 1700 South, which I think, given its low traffic, it would be ideal.
Wait, there's a proposed track station?
Yes. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, it's on the future land use map.
Okay.
But yeah, given the low traffic volume on 1700 South, I think it's a great candidate for a road diet and for bike lanes.
I know this isn't related to this, but when we've talked about this area in the past, and we've talked about, or I've brought up that the lack of plan for this area, but south of 17th, from along 3rd West, all the stuff we're seeing come in there, and we have no pedestrian plan, no anything like that. Do you have an idea of when we might be looking at that area? Because we talked the last time this came up, there's that right past the freeway along the abandoned tracks line. Some of the community members brought up the idea of a linear park and whatnot, and so I was hoping that when we do some planning, we can look at that area as well, because we're just going to continue to see more development along 3rd West there, and we don't have any guidance.
We'll be starting an update. Well, basically create an update to the central community plan for the entire 300 West corridor from I-15. I think that the eastern boundary might be West Temple, but I can't remember the project area. But that'll actually start in the next 2 to 3 months.
Okay, cool. Okay. All right, Nan, do you have anything else you want to hear from us on, or are you good?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Okay.
That is very helpful.
Thank you for your report. I look forward to seeing you come back and what you end up with. Okay, the next item on our work session is the downtown building height and street activation briefing. This will be case number PLN PCM 2022-00529. And we have presenters Jessica Garrow and Callie New. And if you would just state your name for the records before you talk, that would be great.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Jessica Garrow. I'm a principal with Design Workshop.
I'm Callie New, and I am the project manager on this project with Design Workshop.
Get our stuff situated here.
I'll introduce myself. Everybody knows me. I'm Kelsey Lindquist, the project lead on this text amendment. That's,
You were not
yeah.
listed on my cheat sheet, so I didn't call you, so I'm sorry.
It was a last minute decision.
Okay.
That's okay.
If it's not on my cheat sheet, it just doesn't exist. That's all I can tell you.
I'm just not sitting up here in front of you. That's good with me.
Great. Well, we'll go ahead and dive in and just thank you so much for your time tonight. We're really excited to talk with you about the draft proposed changes for the downtown building heights and pedestrian spaces. We do have about a 30-minute presentation because we want to walk through the changes. They're pretty extensive. We will try to go as quickly as possible, but we did want to cover some key areas related to community engagement in addition to some of these code changes. All right, so to start, again, we're here with Design Workshop. I'm Jessica Garrow, been the principal in charge. Callie's with me. We've also had our team members, Marianne Stuke and Ashley McKnight, and we've really enjoyed working with the city and the WFRC team as part of this process. So generally for this project, we're focused on the core portions of downtown. The project boundaries run from I-15 on the west to 200 east, and then from North Temple down to 900 south. This area does include a number of different zone districts, which are all proposed to have some updated changes here. We've used a process based on gathering community input as well as an understanding of existing conditions, and Callie's going to go into those steps a bit more here in a moment. But all of that kind of culminated in to where we are today, which is a review of the proposed code changes, and then we would be moving into the adoption process. So really briefly, I wanted to cover some of the main project elements. The work covers really three main policy areas. So first, we're focused on pedestrian orientation. And that means that we focused on ensuring regulations result in a real accessible downtown that's oriented to pedestrians and is easily accessible for people who are walking or who are maybe in a wheelchair. Second, we focused on reinforcing human scale in design, and this is really addressed on how buildings are placed on the site and how they interact to the street and to the pedestrian areas. So we've included standards that require things like material variation, activation on the first floor, and some facade transparency. And then finally, the code work does focus on building heights. Building heights are generally proposed to increase throughout the study area while seeking to preserve some of the character of different areas of downtown. And I would say it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's very different for each zone district. So now I will turn it over to Callie to run through our overview of our process.
Great, thank you. So our planning process focused on a relevant plan overview of existing documents that sort of guide the goals and then the outcomes of this process. We did a robust existing conditions analysis looking at both the existing code and case study analyses from other communities. We had a couple of different ways to get community input, and then that resulted in code drafting. So the plans that we reviewed were the 2016 downtown plan that sort of set the goals for urban design and the overall vision for downtown, the mid-block walkway that has implications for mobility and connectivity for breaking up the large block sizes, and then the urban forestry plan that guided some of the vegetation standards that are specifically found in the design standards. So our existing conditions analysis was really threefold. We did a site visit that gave a better feel of the different areas within the downtown area and the feel and how those can be sort of nuanced and reflected in the different zone districts. We did an existing code analysis of the code language as it is today and sort of highlighted areas that might be improved through this process. And then a case study review, which looked at both recent developments and then comparable communities. For example, we looked at Phoenix and Las Vegas for how they treat glare and shade. 3 different communities in Canada, Ontario, Toronto, and Vancouver for how they mitigate wind. And then transitions, we looked at Boulder, Colorado and Austin, Texas for how they treat transitions to other, to buildings that are lower. Our community engagement methods involved stakeholder meetings. We had 4 different groups of individuals, and then a visual preference survey that was more broad and released publicly, or to the general public. So we started with the stakeholder meetings that sort of set the our basis of understanding for some opportunities and challenges with the project. We met with the development community, including architects and developers. We met with community representatives, including those that might have accessibility challenges and advocate for mobility. We met with neighborhood councils and representatives, and then the Downtown Development Alliance, which was their general meeting, so it was a larger group. So this is sort of a preview of some of the questions that we asked them. These meetings were virtual, so we asked, what is your view of downtown's public spaces today? How might they be improved? And then some more detailed questions about challenges with the existing municipal code with the development community as they relate to building heights and pedestrian space, and where some of those challenges might be resolved. And then the visual preference survey built on that initial outreach, and we developed 3 different height alternatives that that proposed increasing heights in 3 different areas. We asked concerns about changing building heights. We also provided a visual preference survey that introduced a number of elements that would add pedestrian comfort and design, and asked preferences in that regard. And then also asked about view sheds, and if view corridors to the mountain should be preserved, and if so, where. So these next slides provide some results from those surveys. So these, on the right, you can see the 3 different alternatives that were proposed, the first in the Granary, the second in the Depot District, and the third in the Central Business District. And then the bar graph on the left shows which alternatives were supported. So the bottom bar, if you can't read that, it says I support. So more than half of respondents, the 66% of respondents, were in support of the 3 alternatives, with the alternative 1 in the Central Business District having about 21% of respondents indicating that they don't support. The concerns related to height, again, 50% of respondents said that taller building heights do not concern me, but the largest sort of concern was compatibility with historic buildings, and then impacts to mountain views and the wind tunnel effect. When asked about elements that might help pedestrian comfort and design, overhead covers such as canopies that protect from natural elements, windows that add transparency to the building, pedestrian refuges and seating, and street trees rose to the top of design elements. And then aspects that might help with wind and glare. The most popular response was to prohibit buildings made entirely of reflective glass, and then to put limitations on other materials that are reflective, such as metal, to help mitigate glare. And then for wind tunnel effect, the majority of responses said that it's not an issue in downtown Salt Lake City, and then it's somewhat important. So that sort of guided our thinking there. So this provides a summary of the input and recommendations, showing what we heard on the left and then what we did with that feedback. So just to kind of summarize, getting around downtown is difficult with those with a visual or mobile impairment. People said that things that obstruct their path can be difficult to get through if they have vision impairment or are in a wheelchair. So we required requirements for clear passage within public spaces, including sidewalks. Large block sizes can be uncomfortable for pedestrians, so we encouraged pedestrian-oriented elements in design features, as well as breaking up massing and through facade breaks and adding transparency. I'll kind of skip through these because you can read them, but general concern over impact of glare, so we decreased the percentage of reflective glass that's allowed in upper floors. The wind tunneling effect can be an issue with taller buildings, so you'll note that we required a wind tunnel analysis for buildings of a certain height. And Jessica's going to go over very specific details about where these changes are found in the code section, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
Great. So moving into review of the code language. So within the project area, there are 7 different zone districts. Each of these have been updated to reflect updated dimensions as well as design standards and design review requirements. The proposed code language implements really 6 kind of main themes that we wanted to cover. We sought to clarify code language whenever possible. So you'll see there are a number of red lines where things are deleted, and that's because they're redundant with things that are in the design standards or elsewhere within the zone district. So we really tried to clarify and simplify the language as much as possible. Similarly, we've consolidated that text that's redundant. The proposed requirements will create a more urban feel through things like decreased setbacks and some new requirements for parking lots, so making sure that those are tucked behind buildings as opposed to right along the street edge. We're also trying to incentivize public benefits when additional height is sought, and so that's something that's been embedded into the different zone districts. Standards emphasize walkability, human scale development, and pedestrian interest, so real focus on that pedestrian realm. And then finally, we sought to increase overall compatibility in just design and massing. All right, so to start, there are certain sections that are just updated throughout all of the zone districts. These are all listed on the screen. But essentially, for front yard setbacks, the setback must be designed with usability as a main consideration, as opposed to just having maybe a landscape strip. There needs to be thought about why is there a setback for this building in the downtown? How is it going to be used? So it needs to have landscaping, benches, awnings, seating, things that are going to kind of activate that space and make sure that it's being used. As I mentioned, for surface level parking lots, those must be located behind a primary structure. And we've added some requirements to really just kind of minimize the impact there. We have included language in all of the districts that mid-block walkways are required if that's been adopted as part of the downtown plan or the mid-block walkway plan. These are required to be at least 15 feet in width so that they can be really used. And they have to have a 6-foot unobstructed path to enable clear access, again, for anyone who is on foot or in a wheelchair pushing a stroller. We wanted to make sure that that clear path was included. We have some design elements that are required, things like screening of service areas, location of parking structures, that kind of thing. And then finally, there have been some open space requirements that have been added. So any open space that's greater than 500 square feet has to have a bench, a table, walking path, trees, or some kind of water feature. Again, trying to make sure that those spaces are really being utilized. In the design standards chapter, we have updated some of the processes, and so we wanted to really highlight that for the Planning Commission tonight. So specifically, more projects would be eligible for an administrative review. So the director would review most projects, really many projects, administratively, but would forward a request for a modification to a design standard to the Planning Commission if that request is more than what is allowed in the code. So the code outlines some specific thresholds. If a neighbor who's been noticed can demonstrate that there's a negative impact to their property as part of a modification that was presented, and if a request was denied by the director, the applicant could request that that come to the Planning Commission for review. So that was something that we wanted to make sure that we highlighted for you tonight, because that is a change. To the design standards, we've added some additional requirements specific to streetscape. So there's canopy coverage requirements of 40% and some minimum caliper sizes for trees and some spacing requirements. So again, trying to really dictate and make sure that the streetscape is lively and is able to be used well. We're also limiting the number of curb cuts that can exist to minimize those negative impacts on the pedestrian. Let's say a new addition that we think is really important is related to height transition standards. So these promote a transition in scale between different zone districts and even between buildings within the same zone district. And it really ensures that new development doesn't overwhelm what exists today. Kind of taking some of that public feedback about making sure that things are in scale, particularly related to historic buildings. We wanted to embed that into the code here. So there are some additional requirements related to that height transition that also support goals related to the wind tunnel effect. So having those types of step backs minimizes the impact of wind. Another change is adding maximum facade lengths, that really aims to create more visual interest and comfort at the pedestrian scale. So you're not walking along a long blank wall, but there's some transparency there as well as adjustments in different materials. Currently in the code, there are 2 ways that you can meet requirements related to ground floor use and visual interest, and we have updated those. And again, those are really focused on having spaces that are on the ground floor that add interest to the street. So one option is that the spaces cannot be things that discourage walk-in use. So if you had a residential development, it wouldn't be the mail room on the ground floor, it might be their gym, for instance, and really trying to focus on things that have a little bit more visual interest. Also requiring things like material changes, facade changes, adding art and color. A second option is really creating a clear visual relationship between the building and the adjacent public realm using different architectural elements. So the first one is maybe focused on land uses, and the second is a little bit more on architectural elements. All right. Also modified are our glass requirements. So all ground floor spaces are required to have a minimum of 60% glass, and upper floors are limited to 25 to 50% glass, depending on the zone district. And then that mirror-like glass would be prohibited. We've also added upper floor step backs. This is another aspect that helps on the wind tunnel effect. But essentially, you are required to have some basic step backs once you get to a certain height in the building. From a design review chapter perspective, there are some updated thresholds for planning director approval. And we have made some minor modifications really for clarity to the sections that are bolded here. All right, so moving into zone districts, we did have some basic modifications that were made, again, to really all these zone districts. We've consolidated language and removed language that's redundant. We've also added a requirement that sidewalks have a clear path of 10 feet, so those sidewalk standards are getting larger. Within D1, we have made the requirements for corners and mid-block the same. So right now there are some different height allowances if you're on the corner versus a mid-block, so those are now the same. We've also allowed some additional setbacks for those yards to encourage pedestrian use of the space. On the height piece, height allowances have been adjusted to allow 375 feet without triggering an additional review, and beyond that, it would be a design review that Planning Commission would review. We're also requiring that a wind study on anything that is 150 feet or taller. For D2, we've made some adjustments to yard and setback requirements with a focus on having larger setbacks in residential areas that have lower height and having, again, some transition spaces there. Also, we've added some new requirements here specific to vehicle sales and lease lots, really trying to add some visual interest to those spaces so that they're not just kind of vacant lands. For D3, similarly, we've adjusted some of our height and yard requirements. There's no yard requirement unless there's a residential use in that zone district. And then for height, the base height of 75 feet remains, but the height can now go up to 180 feet with a design review. Currently, the code says you can go up to 90 feet with a design review, so that's a difference. On the D4 zone district. The proposed changes have some new yard setbacks. The current height maximum of 75 feet would remain with the ability to go up to 120 feet. That remains in the code. But a change proposed is that buildings up to 375 feet could be approved through a design review. As part of the public comment period, staff has had some conversations with members of the Japanese community who've expressed some concern about that ability to go up to that higher height, particularly around the Japanese Community Center. And so this is an area that I think our team and staff is going to be taking a look at, and potentially we pull back on those height adjustments in D4, and in areas where it makes sense, maybe rezoning some of those areas that are south of 200 South to maybe the D1 zone district. So that's something that I think we'll be working through as we move through the adoption process. And I'm almost done. I know it's a lot. For GMU, the minimum heights increased from 45 feet to 75 feet, so that's kind of what it is today, and now it's going to be 75 to 180 feet with some additions of some step backs. For general commercial, the maximum height is proposed to increase from 60 feet to 75, but buildings that fall within the depot district, that height maximum will be 150 feet. So there's a difference here in this zone district based off of the geography that you're in. Also some updated standards related to those usable outdoor spaces.
Before you go on, Jessica, what height can they go to under design review?
It's up the 150.
150?
Yeah. Are we 375 with design review?
You saying current regulations or proposed?
Proposed. So if we're in the GC and we're at 75, we can go up to 150?
For CG?
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be 150. Mm-hmm.
And the depot would just be 150 flat?
That's the way the code language is written right now.
Okay, that's what I wanted to clarify.
Can I clarify something real quick? Outside of that, we're not changing the CG height outside of the depot district. So that design review height, I believe, is 90 feet. 90 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So that would stay for the time being. Most of the remaining CG zone is going to be in that 300 West corridor, which when we come back with the ballpark plan, some zoning amendments there, and with that project I was talking about that starts in a few months for the rest of 300 West, the CG zone may be altered dramatically and may catch up. It may be something else. We don't know that. But this proposal is only looking at that small piece that's shown on the map.
So we're only talking really about the depot district within CG, and the depot would have a flat height of 175 to 150 or just 150?
So, yeah, you're right. So the CG zoning district within the depot area, so that boundary that she provided, the by right height would start at 75 feet.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, I just want to make sure my notes are
Right now it's 45 and it caps at 90 through design review.
So it would go from 75 to 150 in the depot district within
those
the
very
CG.
specific boundaries. Yes.
The last set of zone districts is the form-based zone districts. So in these areas, some maximum setback requirements have been added, and ability to have rooftop gardens are included in some detail here. And so with that, again, I know that was a lot to get through, but we wanted to cover some of those highlights from the code language. There were a few questions included in the staff memo that I think we'd all like some feedback on that are on the screen, but we're here to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, thank you, Jessica and Callie and Kelsey. I know I have a lot of feedback, so settle in. But we'll start with other commissioners. Seriously, I'm the only one who has.
Oh,
things to
no,
say.
you're not the only one, but you already said you had a lot, so let's hear it.
What?
You already said you had a lot, so let's hear it.
Well, I don't want to dominate everything, which is
You won't.
typically what I do.
Don't worry.
So I'll start, and then I'll have you guys pipe in. So one of the things that I find to be frustrating is this commercial uses definition. So when we define on the pedestrian level, currently in code, we allow those amenities to be considered as retail or commercial uses, and I think that's horrible. I don't think that activates a pedestrian scale, and there may be certain parts of this plan, like D1 or D2 or whatnot, where those amenities should be really limited. So I like that approach of like amenities can only be up to 25%, but then the other stuff has to be commercial. Otherwise, what's the point? I don't care I don't want to look at people working out in the gym, no matter what, if I'm walking by. So that doesn't really activate it for the pedestrian. And so I would like to take this opportunity to limit the ability for a residential development to utilize amenities for their tenants as that commercial activation. Whole scale, actually, I think that that's a bad approach. We shouldn't really, those aren't like-to-like items. The second one, I have so many notes here.
Can we talk about that just a little bit? Because I agree that it's a less than desirable thing. On the other hand, zoning keeps you from doing something. It doesn't make something happen. So if you say this is commercial, then it could sit empty for 5 years until the demand for commercial in that area actually achieves something. So wouldn't it be better to allow certain uses?
Not in some zones. If we're looking at
rather than it be empty.
But if we're looking at D1, so maybe I can see your point, Brenda, of it being in some of these outliers or not. But I think what happens, what I want to try to address in this is, and maybe that's not the best way to address it, but we have so many residential developments that come through, and it does require, ground floor activation, and they're always amenities. And so we're getting all of these developments and all these people, but we're not really activating the street level. Whatever the solution may be, may not be what I proposed, and that's fine. But I think that's a problem. And we really aren't getting that interaction that I think pedestrian activation is trying to achieve.
Can I chime in? I sort of agree with Amy, and the hope is, I hear what you're saying, it may not be financially viable in and of itself to have a retail development.
But wouldn't just to say something, wouldn't it be, if they could rent that space to a retailer, don't you think they would?
Yes, so I guess the question is could you be asking them a little bit to take a bit of a loss on the commercial space, which I'm actually comfortable doing, to try to get more people staying in that area and living and doing, maybe going to a restaurant, or even, one of the things that shocks me about some of these big developments, I don't know why they don't put in like little bodegas, like even if they're residents, I don't know. I guess I'm not having to
sit empty until you get someone. So if you're saying they're going to take a loss, they'll take a loss and they'll just lock the door and leave it.
If it's space anyway, they're willing, the marginal cost to them of having a tenant that is paying slightly lower rents than they might get in another part of the city.
We're making a lot of assumptions about developers and their projects. I think what we should be focusing on is if pedestrian activation is the issue, what are the design tools we could put in the code to ensure that, regardless of the use, whether it's a gym, whether it's a amenity space, whether it's a coffee shop? Because we can't decide who's going to be the tenant. That's not our role.
I mean, I think the one thing Andrea did say that I think is really important is that in some places, these things are, a coffee shop is considered an amenity, and the developer pays for it to go in there. So it's not out of the question that one consider that an actual amenity versus, so instead of, or in addition to having, your workout space, you also have a coffee bar, as an amenity. But that's getting into a whole different level of regulation that we don't have.
Welcome to our discussion. Is not only for you, but for ourselves. I don't have the answer, but I am consistently frustrated by that what I see as the trend. So just look into that.
I think we can look into that, and it's not necessarily unique to Salt Lake. This is something that's happening in other communities, and you know, there's a big impact when there's residential on the ground floor.
Oh, good. That makes me feel better, actually. Okay, so one of the other questions you ask is, I think in your question was 200 feet height, a good bar for design review. And I'll just pipe in, and then hopefully other commissioners will give their view. When I look at design review, it's not always the height that is triggering it. Sometimes it's just the scale of the development. So it might meet all of the ordinances and the zoning, but it's so big that it triggers a design review. And the only time I'm really concerned about height or look at it is when it is in relationship to what it's abutting against, and is that appropriate, yada, yada. But I am really more interested when we do design review about the length of the building. And you didn't specify, right now it's 200 feet, and you said you would be looking at it, but you didn't specify if that length would change, if it would shorten or become longer. When we do design review, I'm looking at what is that pedestrian activation, what is that relationship, how long is this building, yada, yada. So I don't know for me that putting a number on the height to initiate a design review is the most appropriate.
Chairperson Barry, the facade length isn't changing.
Okay, so it's still going to be 200.
Correct. So anything above that 200.
Right.
And I don't think we're increasing the threshold to have an admin approval. That's usually a sticking point among staff as well.
Okay, because
So,
she just mentioned it in
oddly.
her presentation, but I didn't know if you were going to change it or not.
The length is not changing. It's more trying to add some additional detail of what does that mean in terms of materiality and transparency.
Okay. So I think for commissioners, what is your feeling about what triggers a design review? Because if we're looking at it in this way, this is a good opportunity to have that discussion.
Yeah.
Height isn't what really does it for me.
I would agree. I think the length is more important, because one of my concerns was some of the design implementation of breaking up the facade and trying to make it feel too turn of the century, and like this is how buildings were developed naturally. And over a long facade, it's very difficult to break that up in that way. And that's my concern, is some of these longer buildings get these fake kind of Disneyland facades instead of actually being thought about as a holistic approach, which I think is how architecture usually gets developed in a city. It's building by building, not let's try to make this building look like a lot of little buildings. That just usually just doesn't work, and it makes bad architecture and bad experiences for the pedestrian. So that's my concern, and that's why I think the design review is important for longer buildings. That's kind of my overall.
Any other thoughts?
I'm unclear, and maybe there's a chart I'm missing somewhere that shows the before and the after for these zones.
Yeah, all of the draft chapters were included in the memo, and they
No,
have.
I know, but I said, is there a chart that says, in the D1, it used to be this, and now it's going to be that?
No,
didn't
just
see it.
strike and underline is how we typically do it.
Yeah, but it would be much easier for all of us to review this if we knew sort of, okay, today, the height limit is 75 and 95 with design review, and tomorrow, it will be 150 with 200. I mean, we need to have a sense of what kind of change this is.
Okay.
And
Yeah, we could
how
create a
intense
chart.
this change is in terms of if it's about building height, we really need to, there's a simple way of sort of producing that information, I think, that we don't have. It's buried, it's there, but it's buried in, 145 pages of stuff. So forgive me if I can't remember, as the chairman was actually trying to just write it down, because we don't have it, okay? So that would be one thing I would add to the way we are presenting this information going forward.
And I'm also curious, so this map, what we have, which details the neighborhoods, Oh, it went away. See? This map that details the neighborhoods. It would be great to have a map that also then overlaid what the zone for those were. So I could then correlate it
Information was not.
to what I wrote
in
down
our-
or to the table, the chart that you might provide so that, because I also feel like this is kind of a significant expansion of our view of downtown. I guess organically I consider it 6 South and we're moving into 9th South. So in my mind, I really want to pay attention to what are those zones going on, and is the proposed changes, do I feel like that's compatible with that expansion southward? That would, we're very visual, like if we can see it and parse it out and then compare it, that would be great. You also mentioned in the memo that, so let me get this straight. So if you would have your new maximum with design review, so let's say it's at 180 feet with design review, would you then be allowing them to go up higher than 180 feet if they had a mix of affordable units?
So that is one of the, for lack of a better term, what I would say performance standards
I
within.
can't hear you.
Sorry. It's one of the, maybe what I would call performance standards. When you're exceeding height in D1, you need to show a public benefit, is the way the code language
Is that above the
reads.
180 or up to the 180?
It would be using the height incentives in the affordable housing section.
So it would be for those requests for heights above 200 feet. So the trigger of
Okay.
design review is 200 feet. To qualify, there's 4 or 5 things listed that they'd have to include in the development. One of those would be affordable housing as defined in the affordable housing overlay.
Those are alternatives, right? They're not, you don't have to have affordable housing to do that.
You don't have to have, you can pick one. You
can pick,
it's a
like-
menu. You can pick from it.
Pedestrian scale architecture, which I think should not be included as an incentive like that. If you're going to, it's like, I'll pick the bike racks for 10 points versus, something, real energy conservation. That's going to be the bike racks of this, if you know what I mean, what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. Okay. That's a inside joke. But anyway, it is too easy and too fluffy and too indeterminate. If we're going to allow people to do affordable housing or incentivize them to do affordable housing, let's incentivize them really and not give them a bike rack alternative.
Yeah, I think we brought that up in that overlay discussion. It was like we thought it wasn't stringent or didn't have enough teeth.
Yeah,
it was.
You're allowing somebody to go up an extra, what, I don't know, because I don't have the chart.
Well, I think this
20 stories, let's make them a couple of stories of affordable housing.
Yeah, I think this is a good thing for us to remember the connections here. So when the affordable housing overlay zone comes back, that what we end up recommending to the city council on that is going to then inform what could go higher than 200 feet as one of the possibilities. There are other possibilities. So, keeping that in mind that, they're very related.
But they all need to be hard things to do, not easy things to do instead of doing affordable housing.
So this is one thing where if we put this in these adjusting heights in these zones, then that particular threshold is related to the overlay zone.
Yeah. I think one of the things that was part of that was an open space thing you could do, like a 500 square foot open space was one of the alternatives to affordable housing. And I think, yes, but 500 square feet is about half the size of this room. So that's not enough. I'm sorry. 500 square feet is about 1.5 parking spaces. I think we can do better than that.
So I guess anything above 200 feet, we'd want to see it be an actual public benefit.
Yeah, and it needs to be a public space, not an amenity space on the third floor of a private building.
Yeah,
too.
so like a real public benefit, not a really lame threshold that doesn't really benefit the public, is what I hear.
Yeah.
All right, other thoughts from commissioners?
Yeah.
Go.
I'm sorry. This is, you notice I didn't speak much on the last one because I spent all my time
you were
on this one.
saving it up.
Sorry. First, I want to say that there are a lot of things about this I do like a lot. I like the height transitions part. That's really good. The idea of step backs, the idea that a building should be more than all glass, I think begins to get at some of the image issues, although as well as the glare issue. But I think that one of the let's see, there's some other stuff too, but I think that one of the things we're missing from this is the sense of an image for downtown. The one thing that does speak to that is the glass and materials. And I think that we need to be a little bit more concerned about that. Because what we're getting now is a real conglomerate of this, that, and the other thing. And I'm not talking about styles. I'm really talking about material and massing, window openings, street level openings, and so forth. So I think that we really ought to consider a little bit more the actual composite that is the downtown. And not, I mean, yes, the pedestrian level and how I'm walking along it, that's one part of design, but as long as we're redoing the design guidelines, I think we can get a little more serious about a little bit more consistency in the way we do things. And I know that opens a can of worms that some people aren't going to be comfortable with, but we're building the downtown we're going to have for 100 years right now. And so if we give up that chance to try to make things to have a little more coherence, I think it would be really sad to do that.
And Brenda, can we have a comment related to that?
Sure.
Before you move on.
Yeah, I actually want to piggyback a bit on that. So my first reaction to this plan is it looks good to me because there's more by right construction and we're allowing a bit more density. It is really hard for me to take pedestrianness all that seriously in downtown right now. No, I'm totally serious. Like, we have big buttons right outside City Hall on all four corners. Like, it's just, so I don't know whether they're planning on fixing the streets. I've kind of just given up on downtown until they fix the streets. And I realize this maybe, I don't know whether this was part of their purview to fix the streets so that they have you can get across the street before the light changes and not get hit, or like, I don't know. I'm sorry, and I don't know if this is part of your purview, but I would like to see how we're also going to kind of integrate streets to be a little more human scale.
Yeah, yes. And part of that is street design itself, which is partly an issue, a big issue. Part of it is how the building scale relates to the street, too, because we want the building scales to and this is why I'm kind of confused about the height stuff. We have very wide streets almost everywhere, and then we don't. And some are fairly narrow alleyways that were created over a long period of time. The mid-block walkways, which are also mid-block streets, which are also just smaller streets throughout. And I think in creating mid-block walkways, for example, we ought to take into consideration the buildings on either side in terms of the width of the the mid-block walkway. So if you're building a new mid-block walkway, it can't be 15 feet if the buildings on either side are 250 feet, because then it's just a wind tunnel, right? On the other hand, why not make a bigger, wider one? I mean, I think we have a good example of that going up on State Street right now, where there's a pretty large open space being created between two. It's really nicely scaled in terms of the height versus the width of the mid-block sort of entertainment zone, I guess you might call it there. So that's something to consider in the design guidelines, is this idea that there's a sense of enclosure that's created by, and it's not too much and it's not too big too. So that gets into things like sidewalk widths, but mostly mid-block walkways, and street trees, which I'm really happy about the street trees and the landscaping things that you've got in there. I think that is all really super important. It's one of the most important things we have for urban design. So that's critical, but having the street trees that then reduce, create a sense of enclosure themselves as well. So that's something else. Okay. We talked about the incentives already where I don't, no bike racks. One of the things which has bugged me for a very long time about the current design guidelines is this whole issue of vertical and horizontal design changes, which I think has made some really terrible buildings in this city. Because people come in there and go,
Yeah.
and change materials about every 2 feet or 10 feet, and I think that might be because of our guidelines. It might be because of individual people reviewing the designs. It might be because that's a style lately, although I do not see it in other cities. So I'm having to think that it might be something to do with the way we're reviewing projects. These projects have 20, 30 different materials for a 6-story building. Give me a break. This is just, they're just...
Yeah,
Those are not standards. Those we don't have standards that require that many materials.
I know, but we have
So-
standards that specifically speak to horizontal and vertical design changes.
And that's fine. If you want to propose removing those, we're happy to do that. I do want to go back to your last comment about mid-block walkways, because one of the things that we have to consider is that anytime we are our code does in many instances actually require mid-block walkways. And that is an exaction of a private property right. And when we're doing that, we have to make sure that we're passing a couple of legal tests. And so basically that extraction has to be the minimum necessary to address the impact of that development. And there's some very well-defined court cases in the U.S. Supreme Court that establish that, including one that I think is one of the key ones that's directly related to this, which involved the exaction of a trail, which is very, very similar to this.
I know.
So I just want to make sure that we're aware of that when we're trying to figure out what the right width of a mid-block walkway is, because that is very, very critical and important.
Yeah, I think it would vary with of course, with the height of the buildings. But here's the other thing: I think it's part of this that if a developer has to give part of his property for mid-block walkway, then that area, footprint area, although it can be added to the height of the building. Isn't that correct?
That's one of those offsets. So you're
Yeah.
right.
So they're not actually giving up any square footage. They are maybe adding another elevator floor or two. So it's not terrible, So.
Well, and I have some comments about the mid-block walkways, because we get excited at my office when we're talking about mid-block walkways and the potential that they have, because they do create another space and a potential for engagement, especially with pedestrians. But I think what happens above the mid-block walkways are kind of neglected. And I think that that's an opportunity that's being missed, where you can add balconies that maybe encroach and overhang the mid-block walkways. You can create pass-throughs and connect buildings with pedestrian bridges. You can do a lot of things that create engagement where you have eyes down onto the walkways. Because when I hear mid-block walkway, immediately I think I'm in Chicago, I'm looking at a dumpster alley. And I don't want that to be our mid-block walkways. I don't want them to be utilitarian. I don't want them to be where everybody stashes their stuff to, at the end of the day. What they should be is an opportunity to create pedestrian engagement. And what I think by doing that is you can add arcades, which help cover the mid-block walkways. You can add all kinds of things that I think make them more enticing to developers to add to their project, because it actually makes their project better. And at the same time, it gives you more opportunity for retail, outdoor dining. There's so many opportunities in those walkways that you don't get when you're pushed right up against the sidewalk, because now you can kind of create these inner courtyards. And I think having some language about that in there would be really great. I also the other thing I was going to bring up was the arcade idea, where we can push buildings out further. closer to the street, because we have such wide streets. Why aren't we taking up the sidewalk with the building, creating some protection for pedestrians, protection for the sidewalks? I did a lot of work in the Middle East for a while, and the sun is so overbearing that arcades are almost a requirement because it's so hot. And we have a similar situation. In the summer, it gets really hot, and then in winter, it snows, and then you have to like move all this snow around. Arcades are just a great way to deal with that and create more density on some lots. So I think getting creative with our standards might, I know that it complicates things, but I think it also incentivizes people to do better projects instead of, I think the regulations that I get a little bit, to second kind of what we were talking about with the changes of materials, those are the things that I think create some of these designs we're seeing where you have in-plane material changes, you have corners where you have brick that goes to the corner and then it stops because they're trying to emulate something that doesn't exist anymore, brick construction. So I think, using the overall form as a basis and trying to push that forward over materiality. And I think that's where the mid-block walkway comes in, the sidewalk engagement, the setbacks. That's where we can kind of create those dialogues of architecture. So anyway, that's my soapbox.
Yeah. Everything he said.
Got it.
I can, so an arcade is basically where you overhang the building over the sidewalk, and then you create columns, and then you can have covered seating, you can have covered walkways.
Covered shops.
And covered shops, and it just creates kind of this little more private, intimate space for people to interact in.
Okay. Any further thoughts, and then we'll run through your discussion topics to make sure we've hit them.
I just want to echo that what's just been said, that my concern is less about what's going on up 100 feet above me than it is the pedestrian realm, and that's where I really want to see that we make sure that we're making a quality environment. And one of my big concerns in the downtown is that we do have lots of first floor business space that is offices or banks that also is not very active even during regular business hours, and it's definitely not active in the evenings. So I would like to see a way to address that.
Last thoughts, Brenda?
I would like the commission to weigh in on the idea that the director, i.e. the staff, not the commission, is basically given over all this kind of design review activity. There's very little that actually would come to us.
So yeah, remind me, was it
versus now?
Right, up to 200 feet was, where was the threshold that the director then would come to us?
200 feet.
200 feet.
Come to you in the downtown. So
in the D1.
Mm-hmm.
I particularly like that aspect of the proposal because I do want to make it clear the public still has opportunities to give feedback to planning staff. So it's not that the public doesn't have feedback. Again, I guess I like the idea of by right construction, and many times I don't, there's a lot to do for the planning commission. We spend a lot of time sitting here and it's interesting, but I trust the staff. And anyway, so I'm good on that.
So I think if we really address all those components that we're concerned about, where I find sometimes things that are delegated to staff that they're like, oh yeah, well it met this standard, but if it came to us, it would not fly. Right, so if we really address all those things we've been talking about and make sure those are articulated well, then when staff and the director review it, they've got what is there. And right now, I don't think they have that. That they just
I don't think there's enough there.
Right.
I agree with that comment.
So maybe if we felt like all of those components that we've been talking about and debating were fleshed out and more real for us, that then you would feel more confident to have that staff director review up to 200 feet.
The problem with design review in general is that a lot of things are very judgmental. You know, it's the problem with aesthetics in general, actually. It's a judgment call in lots of ways. And so if I feel like the staff has expertise in this, I would feel more comfortable. So I would feel more comfortable if this created a position in the staff that was an actual architect who was looking at some of these things.
Well, see, and I don't know that I think there's architects and then there's the rest of us. Right? And we speak different languages.
Well, yeah, but sometimes some people who are architects can see things before as images in here that are not something that
I wonder
others can see.
if it's more about fleshing out what we think the intent of said thing is. So the intent of breaking up this length is for this, and this. If they had more articulation on the intent, do you think then it would yield a more sufficient foundation for them to do a review?
There's no way you can legislate against ugly buildings. There's just no way to do that. So,
well, sure, and what's
unfortunately-
ugly to you, I might really like, and vice versa. So that again is judgment.
I
and
doubt
subjective.
I doubt that that's true. Actually, most people do agree when things are pretty good looking.
No, I think
so-
most things growing up are ugly. You might like some of them.
Well,
and I think they're ugly.
I think a lot of them are ugly too. So that's why I'm concerned about getting this right.
Yeah, I think that I agree with that. So I'm just, I don't know the answer to this, but maybe we can think about it.
I'll
more.
add to the confusion because my concern is over-regulating design, because I think that's where we run into issues where people just prescriptively tack on a facade that is what the regulation says, and then they get through and they're fine, they build their building, but it really has no feeling, no heart. They haven't thought about the city at all. They just thought about this piece of paper that says I have to have windows every 5 feet and I need this material to change every 10 feet, and now I've met all my requirements, and now our city looks awful. So I think outcomes are more important than regulations, and I think if we can figure out a way, and this is every city's problem, is figuring out how to regulate outcomes versus dictating standards. That's the problem we're trying to solve here. It's my opinion, your opinion. It's what are the outcomes that we want to achieve, and then how do we achieve those outcomes?
Yeah, I think that's where we differ, is how do we achieve those outcomes?
Yeah.
Right? So you have different ideas of what than I would. So I think, again, those are still always very subjective. So I always then go back in my head of like, well, I guess outcome equals intent for me, same thing. How to just articulate that sufficiently for staff so that you have enough information to move forward to get an outcome. I don't know the answer. These are just, I think, as we redo these zones, we're obviously keenly interested in those outcomes because of what we've seen, how the city is developing. I think it's a lot of ugly buildings. Some people like them, but how do we achieve better outcomes to get to us to the next level of being a city?
So I have one comment to add to
Please
that.
do,
It's
Adrienne.
way outside the box, but when I worked in Baltimore 18 million years ago, we had a design advisory panel, and it was architects, and for significant keystone projects, they provided this kind of advice earlier in a development process to get that feedback by people who know what they're talking about, not me or Andrew. We can talk about other things, but just not that. So, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I think there's value to having that kind of advisory board that's also citizen, volunteers to provide the kind of advice on design.
$50
$50, all right.
nothing.
They're architects. Maybe they want $75 a day. I don't know. But something to think about as we struggle with how design fits in our code and which body is the best entity to make decisions on those standards and objectives.
Why isn't it us? Why isn't the way we're doing it right now?
Because we're not architects, other than we have two architects who can really speak this language in a way that the rest of us.
Mike's a planner. Trained by me.
Yeah,
Again, I mean, I go back to, again, we speak very different languages, so, sometimes what architects like, it's like,
we
no,
do,
I-
but we
I-
have,
but
we
I
have the
think
same
that-
goals. We want walkability. We
Good
want,
question,
No, it is a good question.
What it is right now, what increasing to 200 feet? Are we seeing too many things? Are our meetings too long? Like, I've heard a lot of things like, our meetings are too long, we gotta quit making these decisions about fences or whatever. And at some point, we have one item on the agenda now. I don't know. Like, why can't we be the ones?
Don't worry, that'll change.
review everything that's 3 stories and above. I'm just kidding.
It speaks to development cost.
Yeah,
and
exactly. It's a-
time. Everything, every review process,
it
every
slows down
additional
the project.
approval increases the cost of a project. And if another concern is affordable housing and trying to get more affordable housing in a place like downtown, adding another planning commission review doesn't help get us there.
And if
By some estimates, it's like half the cost of buildings right now is discretionary review, depending on the estimate, and that's, the consensus is that is a huge part of what has gone on with affordability in the last 40 years. Specifically, it coming to discretionary, each panel, each level of discretionary approval adds to developers' costs in a way that staff adds to sometime, but not in nearly the same way as every time there's a hearing. Because again, every time you send it back, oh, well, let's just make some few changes, and you'll come back in like 3 months, and it really adds up in costs.
We're not really a discretionary review board either, because we are
Some things are
driven.
matters of taste.
We
I don't know
did,
what
but we
else
don't
matters
do
of
that.
taste is other than discretionary.
But we don't do that.
I
It's
would
important,
just
but we don't do it.
add that increasing the threshold does alleviate some staff time to work on city-initiated projects as well. And so that's why we're having the discussion this evening.
So I'm gonna just say, I think if we, when this comes back, if we have that kind of map overlay to the chart of then when it would come to design review for us, would be helpful, because it feels like it's a moving target for each zone as well, and we don't really know.
The charts are my favorite part of the staff.
Okay. Okay.
The matrix
We
is.
can do that.
So I think that would be helpful for the next one for us to really then kind of hone in on the answer to that question. Okay, I think we hit most everything. The wind tunnels, honestly, I don't know. Does anybody know about I think that's where I would defer to.
Well, when you get the tallest, when your buildings get taller, you do get wind coming down off the surface of the building and jamming you to the
But what height of a
ground.
building is it appropriate for us to instigate a wind tunnel?
That's a scientific question,
That's an
actually.
engineering question.
Yeah.
And I think with our wider streets, it's less of an issue. Like you get it in New York, you get it in Chicago, where everything's narrow and it
Slam you to the ground.
it does put, like I've had to lean forward in Chicago, it pushes you pretty hard, but I don't know if that's as big of an issue currently, and that may be a regulation for later on.
So that was one of the discussion topics they listed in the memo, and I think that we would just really probably defer to what's the scientific engineering recommendation for that. I don't think we can answer if the other height increases are appropriate until we really see that overlay of where that will be effective or where that will be implemented. And then I think we've discussed the rest pretty clearly. I think we just need a little bit more information to relate what these proposed changes are to the specific zones and where they relate to that neighborhood map.
I ask for clarification. Your second statement about you're unsure about the proposed height and how it's related, could you expand on that?
Oh, yeah, because when I mentioned that I feel like this is a pretty significant expansion of downtown, so I don't know, I want to see really what are the proposed heights to the zone for like the Granary and Central Ninth, and do I feel like those new heights are appropriate for, because that's to me expanding southward. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
So I can't really, personally, I can't really say like, oh yeah, these are appropriate, because I still don't really quite visually see where they'll lay out in the more of the periphery.
Okay.
I think the depot's great. Go for it. There's nothing there, but we could have height there. There are certainly places where we could be doing more height.
Yeah, and the boundaries that were decided are the master plan boundaries, the downtown master plan boundaries. So that it's correlated. So the area, the study area is actually the master.
So that area map is including things that we're not touching, is that what you're saying?
That area map is the downtown master plan area.
So I just think that I just think there's that periphery that I'd want to just take an extra look at of understanding if I think those increased heights are appropriate for those neighborhoods. But I see what you're saying. All right, let's wrap this up. Any final comment for the team?
I'm excited for more height.
Yeah, I only have one question about height, and that is, I mean, what we're seeing right now is a build out of our downtown, so we're getting a lot more areas that we can start to call urban, you know, where things are getting denser, and that's a good thing, and we all agree on that. But if we start allowing extra height everywhere, which it seems like we're doing, or this proposal does, that concentrates that could concentrate the extra height in several buildings instead of spreading it out across the entire area. It's sort of the Washington, D.C. effect versus, it has a height limit, period, that's it. Or, you know, the sort of New York skyline where there's everything here and then there's everything here in Midtown. And so, you know, instead of, we're kind of, we might be actually taking the potential density we have to infill all of these little things and make our place more urban and putting it into taller buildings. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So I'm a little concerned about the height, increasing the height without being sure that we're going to have continuous demand. So we'll just have one big building here and another one big building there. So especially, for example, in the CG zone, you know, we haven't even demonstrated really that there's a demand for even 90-foot buildings there now. So, I mean, there's one maybe.
There have been regular requests for 90 feet buildings in the CG, which is why it was included in this.
Yeah,
through design review and PD, you know. I guess I'm not quite clear, Commissioner Scheer, on what you're saying, if there's a concentration of heights. I think what we're attempting to do in these distinct neighborhoods that are actually considered all part of downtown, but also have their own identity, is to create distinct heights in those areas. So are you suggesting that it would be, maybe people would pick to develop elsewhere than they would in the down D1 zone because the height is allowed now in CG or GMU?
I'm just saying, look, if you know that you're going to build another 1 million square feet in the next 10 years, do you want it in 2 tall buildings or in 10 medium buildings? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's tied to the market demand. So if we only have a fixed amount of demand, are we getting it in 2 very tall, skinny, small buildings or across a broader footprint?
Yeah, because if we get it across a broader footprint, then we have a more urban area, a more pedestrianized area, a more ability to sort of have a moderate-sized city instead of, 1 or 2 big towers.
Well,
That's helpful, thank you.
And I think our developers are going to dictate some of that because they're obviously not going to have money to spend on one giant building when they're probably going to have to piggyback off one of their other developments. So right now, most of our developers don't go above 75 feet, mostly because of code reasons. Fire code changes drastically at 75 feet. So I think one of the things that was hurting us the most was not allowing the extra height because a building's not feasible just over 75 feet because all the extra requirements that are required for that building to be safe don't pencil unless you go to 100 or above. Then it does. So I think this really opens up the ability for us to actually have taller buildings and promote more development. And there's still going to be the smaller developers developing the infill lots and filling in that lower level, and they're not going to go all the way up because they can't afford it. So I think there's still going to be diversity, and it just creates more diversity in our city.
Okay. I feel like you've gotten more than you asked for, but
thank you. This is great. We really appreciate it. It's really helpful as we move to finalize the language. So thank you for the time.
yeah, thank you for your work, and we look forward to what the next step is. seeing this come back. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, we have one last item. Commissioners, do you want to punch through this or do you need a break? Punch? Okay, we're punching through. All right.
I'm going to stay over here because I don't have a
I
presentation.
think it'll be pretty fast.
This should be pretty quick because this is a follow-up to the last meeting regarding the policies and
So
procedures.
the last item in our work session is the update to the policies and procedures. Go ahead, Nick.
So at the last meeting, there were a couple of questions about certain aspects of the policies and procedures. One of them was about consent agendas. And as we were looking at it and talking through that and reviewing it and trying to figure it out, the one thing, we went back and we looked, and the one thing that we noticed is that anytime that we had a land use application on the consent agenda for the first time approval, it was pulled off. And so what we realized is, like, we're not actually using the consent agenda for land use applications. We're using it for other commission business. And so what we did is that we pulled out from the policies and procedures the discussion about how to deal with land use applications on that consent agenda. And so we simplified that quite a bit. But we wanted everyone to know that that is kind of where we landed as we reviewed that. And it simplified that section quite a bit. The other section, we talked a little bit about adding in some decorum things, that those are in there. And then I'm trying to find the other change was the quorum. And particularly for hybrid meetings, because we want to be able to have that option. And the state legislature passed a bill this last year that said cities can, or commissions can do that, public bodies can do that, provided they've established rules for how to determine attendance and voting and things like that. And so that's the other significant piece of this. And then at the last meeting, there was a question about abstaining and what that meant for quorums and recuse. I'm trying to find where it is in here. But as we looked at it, I don't think that we made any changes because we thought that it was, the whole idea behind that was to create an avenue for the commission to have some discretion on why somebody may be abstaining or why somebody may want to recuse themselves, and what happens if that puts us below a quorum. And so that was really the intent there, is to address that so that if by chance, I mean, fortunately right now I think we have a fully appointed commission, but we know that that's not always going to be the case. And so sometimes when we only have like 6 people here and that's the quorum, and somebody has to recuse themselves for something, then suddenly we don't have a quorum. So we wanted to make sure that we could find ways to address that. And so we included some changes and some clarification there. And that was it.
So, Nick, I still think we may have a conflict between B12 and B18. And that is where you added that in B18, you added, let me scroll down there, that for purposes of determining whether a quorum is present, all members present shall be counted. But then in B12, we state if you're recusing yourself, that we still have this special and unusual circumstance that then the commission can decide you to come back if we need you for a quorum. But if we're looking at B18, just the fact that they're in the building and present would mean we can count them for the quorum, whether they abstain or not. So can I just get some clarity on if that is really conflicting?
Yeah, thank you. I don't think we actually have a real direct conflict between those two provisions, and here's why. The state law doesn't say that if you have a true conflict where you have to recuse yourself, that you have to leave the room. Your rules create a presumption that you should leave the room, but a special circumstance would be if we're going to lose a quorum because of that, you're allowed to stay in the room, so you would be considered present under the quorum rules. and we would maintain that quorum.
So in B18, though, we say, in determining whether a quorum is present, all members present shall be counted, including members who abstain from a particular vote. A particular member is considered present when they are physically present at the place identified in paragraph 14 or otherwise connected to the meeting via electronic. So even if they leave the room, they're still in the place that's identified as our meeting place, because we don't identify this specific room.
I think the anchor location is defined specifically as a room.
Because we move rooms, like.
Okay, maybe the place held in a room. So we don't specify which room, but it is a room. So I guess when I reviewed this, was thinking of the physical location being the room.
The room.
And so what we've traditionally seen is if there's a conflict of interest, the individual steps out of the room, right?
Right.
And then that individual wouldn't count for purposes of maintaining your quorum if they step out.
But then that conflicts with B18 that says a quorum, they're still considered part of the quorum if they're in the place via B14, which identifies the building and not the room.
No, 14, it says a room as determined appropriate located at 451 South.
Yeah, so I'm just curious that those, like, in the event this happens, I feel like there's two ways to view this quorum issue. I mean, I don't think this is going to come up very often. It never has in my 4 years, but as I read that, I just thought we had two different directions happening. Either I have a quorum because they're physically in the building, but they're recusing themselves, but they're in the place. Is the building.
I don't think under state law application you would be considered a quorum if you commissioners were roaming the hallways. I don't think under state law that would be viewed as having a quorum and holding a meeting with a quorum.
Sure. But I guess just then under B12, I don't want to beat this horse to death, but is just, you know, what would be considered special or unusual circumstance if you're just next door, you're still like you're in the meeting, but you had to leave to recuse yourself. Wouldn't your presence then still be considered a quorum, whether you're sitting in your chair or if you're next door?
Well, that's what we were trying to fix, I think, was to say that that is a special or unusual circumstance.
Yeah.
If someone who otherwise would recuse themselves and then leave the room and therefore would not be counted for quorum purposes in that moment, that is a special and unusual circumstance by which the commission could agree to let that person who otherwise has a conflict remain. Because state law doesn't say that that person has to leave. It says they can't participate in the conversation and they can't vote.
Okay.
So you've gone as far as to say they have to leave the room. In your
Yeah, I still think, like, anyway, it's not going to really come up. It doesn't come up very often. So these feel like those are two different directions for us. Okay, any other comments on this? Otherwise, we can adopt this. I would need a motion to do that.
I will make it a motion to adopt. Do I need to say anything special or just?
The updated
Okay.
policies and procedures for the planning
I
commission.
move to adopt the Planning Commission policies and procedures.
I'll second.
Who seconded? Who? You, Brenda? Okay.
That doesn't help, does it?
Brenda. Okay, so I have a motion from Mike and a second from Brenda to adopt the Salt Lake City Planning Commission policies and procedures. Let's go ahead and take a vote. Maureen?
Yes.
Adrian?
Yes.
Levi?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Amy?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Brenda?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
And Andra?
Yes.
Okay, that motion passes unanimously. You look like you were going to say something,
I
Nick.
was just going to add, so our next meeting is very likely going to be a hybrid meeting. We have one agenda item, but we anticipate a very large crowd. So just to give you a heads up, we chose to try to make that a hybrid meeting so that we could hopefully alleviate the number of people in the room and give people options. So just wanted to let you know that.
Okay.
How does that work? How does that work? Because we haven't had one of those yet.
Yeah, it'll be a trial.
So that's why we adopted these policies and procedures, is that we need to have an anchor location where the public can come, but there could be the option for commissioners or the public to participate remotely. And so we will be providing some instruction of that and be working with the technical experts in the city to do the best we can in pulling it off. So.
Okay. Well, we'll be geared up for that. It'll be a nice trial and error. That's it for tonight. Thank you all. I appreciate your attendance and participation. Have a good one.
Before you all leave, I have those books that you requested. If you want one, please meet me over at the cart over there.